let's focus here on the account itself, for now just the version in Exodus, since the version in Deuteronomy is purely Moses' recollection. Starting from chapter 19, verse 3, it says that Moses goes up to God, presumably meaning up the mountain, from which in the next verse God speaks to him. Moses, of course, doesn't need a mountain to talk to God, but hey, here's a mountain, so let's do it on the mountain. God gives him a 3-verse covenant statement to convey to the Israelite people. In verse 7, Moses gathers only the elders and puts before them, quote, all the things that God commanded, unquote, which was actually nothing, since the prior communication was just a covenant. If you do this, then I will do that. Anyway, the entire nation answers back that, quote, everything God said we will do, unquote. Although it's not clear when the entire nation appeared on the scene here, since Moses was only speaking to the elders. Now, we can ask how anyone can actually speak to an entire nation without, say, broadcast technology, but let's ignore that for now. Moses relates this answer back to God without climbing the mountain this time. Apparently, God can hear Moses from anywhere, but cannot hear the entire nation speaking. In verse 9, God tells Moses he will come down in a thick cloud so the people can hear when God speaks to Moses. No mention of a mountain and no seeing God. Then Moses tells God again what the people said, because why not? More is better. And then in verse 11, God says that he will come down on Mount Sinai in sight of all the people. No mention of hearing God, but when they hear the ram's horn sound, they can go up the mountain. In verse 14, Moses comes down the mountain to where he already was and tells the people to be pure and be ready for the third day. In verse 16, we are told that on the third morning there was thunder and lightning and cloud on the mountain and a loud blast of a shofar. We can assume the people heard and saw all that because it says the people trembled as Moses led them to the foot of the mountain. In verse 18, the mountain is now smoke and fire rather than thunder and lightning. Inconsistent, but we'll let it go. And it's now the mountain that is trembling, perhaps an earthquake. According to verse 18, God is already on the mountain, but not according to verse 20. Contradiction again, but this doesn't really matter since we're only trying to look at what the people actually are said to have witnessed. In verse 19, Moses speaks, we're not told what he says or from where, and God answers him in thunder. We're not told what he says or from where. Then God calls Moses up onto the mountain. They have a somewhat comical misunderstanding about prior staging instructions, God now insisting that the people not come up on the mountain, even though they already heard the shofar blast indicating the coast was clear, and that they shouldn't break through to look at God even though he said he would be in sight of everyone. Moses assures God everything is copacetic, and evidently with his unfounded concerns put to rest, God tells Moses to come back with Aaron alone, but for good measure tells Moses again that the people should not come up. Then Moses goes back down the mountain, forgets about Aaron, and instead speaks to the people. We are not told what he says, and that's the end of chapter 19. So far, the people have seen lightning or maybe fire and heard thunder and or a shofar blast and perhaps felt the mountain tremble. Chapter 20 begins out of the blue with God speaking what we know as the 10 Commandments or Decalogue, which include the famous commandments to honor your father and mother, remember the Sabbath, don't murder, don't steal, etc. It does not say to whom he addresses this speech. However, it seems from verses 15 and 16 later that God is speaking to Moses alone, even though Moses is still together with the Israelites at the foot of the mountain. We have to presume Moses is memorizing it all as he hears it, and there's no indication that the Israelites are hearing anything. After the conclusion of the Decalogue, verse 15 says that the people witnessed the thunder and lightning, the shofar sound, and the mountain smoking, and they fell back to a distance. Nothing about seeing or hearing God. They tell Moses to intercede between themselves and God, because if God actually speaks to them, they will die. So they remain at a distance while Moses goes into the thick cloud where God is. No mention now of thunder, lightning, smoke, or even mountain, just cloud. Then starting in verse 19, God speaks to Moses alone. He tells Moses to relate to the Israelites that they themselves saw God speaking to them from the heavens, which they really did not in any sense, either the speaking part or the heavens part. And then in chapter 21, God lets fly with instructions for building an altar and 3 chapters of assorted laws known as the Covenant Code, including more about the Sabbath, which Moses is again presumably furiously memorizing, and some instructions for attacking the land of Canaan, and promises to send an angel that he never does. The people hear none of this, of course, because it is a private communication to Moses alone. Then, in chapter 24, God tells Moses, who may or may not already be on the mountain, to come up with Aaron, Nadav, and Avihu, and the 70 elders, but only Moses should come near. But that doesn't actually happen, and instead Moses goes and repeats God's commands to the people, who reply in unity, quote, "All the commands that God spoke we will do." It's not clear whether Moses at this time has communicated the Decalogue, the Covenant Code, or both, or something else. Then it says that Moses wrote down all the commands, presumably from his memory. Whether on tablets or on scrolls, it does not say. Next morning, Moses makes an altar, they kill some animals, and Moses reads the Book of the Covenant to the people. What exactly that contains, and whether it's different from what he had just told all the people and wrote down on the previous day, we are not informed. And the people again say, quote, "All that God spoke we will do and obey." Moses seals the covenant by splashing some blood. Then it gets weird. In verse 9, Moses, Aaron, Nadav, Avihu, and the 70 elders go up. Whether up to the mountain or up somewhere else is not clear. If it's the mountain, that would be odd, since Moses was explicitly told not to bring them in verse 1. In any case, after they are up, they actually see the God of Israel with something like sapphire under his feet. They see God and eat and drink. Now, this is quite a surprise to us, and it's directly contradicted by the account in Deuteronomy where Moses reminds the people that they saw no form of God at all. Back to the verses, you might think the sighting of God by the elders would be the prototypical example of a revelation that would be passed down through the ages, seeing God himself, and yet we never hear of it again. There are many occasions in the Bible where the Israelites are instructed to remember historical events or to teach specific things to their children, but never this. Indeed, there is something very wrong with this passage. The very next verse makes it seem as if this episode never happened. In verse 12, God now tells Moses to come up to him on the mountain, as if he's not already there. God says he will give Moses the stone tablets with teachings and commandments, but whether these are the ones that they had already discussed or some new ones is not clear. Then Moses and Joshua, his attendant, get up, but apparently only Moses now goes up the mountain. The elders are instructed to wait with Aaron and Hur, at a distance. No mention of Nadav and Avihu, and Joshua has disappeared. So the elders are clearly not on the mountain, and nothing is mentioned about the elders having literally just seen God. So that's that. Well, what else happens? In verse 15, Moses goes up the mountain again to where he already was, and now cloud covers the mountain as if it hadn't already. The presence of God sits in the cloud for 6 days for unknown reasons, while Moses does who knows what. On the 7th day, God calls to Moses from within the cloud, and in verse 17, God appears to the Israelites again as a fire on the mountaintop. Moses goes into the cloud where he already was, and climbs the mountain to where he already was, and now he hangs out for the famous 40 days and 40 nights. And instead of giving Moses some stone tablets like he said, God lets fly with 6 chapters of instructions about how to build the tabernacle, how to inaugurate the priests, and how to take a census, and again about the Sabbath. Then, at the end of chapter 31, God gives Moses 2 tablets of the pact. And again, we're not told what specifically is on them, but presumably not chapters upon chapters of tabernacle assembly. So, up till this point, with the exception of the experience of the elders seeing God and his majestic feet, basically the experience of the masses has been one of thunder, lightning, cloud, smoke, fire, shofar, and trembling. Okay, then in chapter 32, we have the episode of the golden calf, which, let's face it, could probably have been avoided if God had told anyone it was going to be a 40-day situation. Anyway, Moses goes down the mountain, gets enraged when he sees exactly what God told him he would see, and shatters the 2 tablets of the pact. Then, in verse 26, Moses initiates a massacre to get the people back under control, citing commands from God that God never gave, and Moses then goes back to God, whether on the mountain or not, it does not say. God tells him to lead the people where he was instructed, again following that angel that God will provide, but never does. Then, in verse 35, God punishes the people with the plague, even though in verse 14 he had decided not to. So, thanks very much. In chapter 33, God tells Moses to start traveling toward Canaan and how God will conquer the Canaanites again with that angel. And verse 7 makes it sound like they are traveling, with a description of how Moses would pitch the tent of meeting outside the camp and talk to God freely there, which happens to be contrary to everything we were formerly told about the tent of meeting, which had it as part of the tabernacle yet to be built. And anyway, in verse 11, we are introduced as if for the first time to Joshua again. Hello, Joshua, who, as it turns out, is actually a child. Whatever. Moses has the mysterious conversation with God, apparently not on the mountain this time, asking God who God will send with him on the journey, evidently not convinced by God's repeated promises that he would send an angel, and perhaps rightly so. Moses requests to see God's presence and know God's ways. All very mysterious, but perhaps a good prelude to resuming the Israelites' journey. But then in chapter 34, we are back at Mount Sinai, and Moses is instructed to carve 2 tablets and bring them up to the top of the mountain, and no one else is supposed to come up. Let's see if they can do it right this time. Moses goes up, God comes down again in a cloud, and makes the strange proclamation known as the 13 attributes of mercy. Why now? Who knows? Moses bows low to the ground as if he's meeting God for the first time, and pleads for God to accept the Israelites as if they hadn't already made a covenant or 2 or 3. Then in verse 10, God makes another covenant that he will again conquer the Canaanites if the Israelites will observe another random set of laws, including not worshiping other gods, destroying sites of foreign worship, observing the Sabbath again, and certain holidays, and so on. And even though the set of instructions this time is much shorter than the first, Moses is still there 40 days and 40 nights, which might make you want to say, fool me once. But in any case, in verse 28, Moses writes down on the tablets the terms of the covenant, which you might think would be the covenant God just introduced in verse 10 with the phrase, quote, "Behold, I make a covenant with you." But the next words are the 10 statements, which suggests that Moses actually writes down the Decalogue, something totally different, which we were led to believe he had already written down many chapters earlier. In verse 29, Moses comes down off the mountain with the tablets, this time with his face glowing and scary because God spoke with him. Although why this facial condition didn't happen all the other times that God spoke with him, we are not told. Moses calls to the people, and Aaron and the chieftains come, but not the people, with the chieftains apparently replacing the elders for this scene. Moses speaks to them, but we don't know what he says, and only then do the rest of the people come close, and Moses tells them everything that God said to him on Mount Sinai, although it's not clear during which visit. Verse 34 suggests that after this, Moses no longer goes to Mount Sinai to speak to God, but can speak to him from somewhere else that he goes into and out of, although it's not clear where that is, or really why any specific place is necessary since he got along just fine without one before. Then in chapter 35, Moses assembles the whole community to tell them what God commanded, which he had already done 4 verses earlier, or so we thought. Perhaps he will read the Decalogue or the Covenant. But instead, we get chapters of Tabernacle again, and that's the end of the book of Exodus. So what can we say about the theophany at Sinai as far as what the entire nation witnessed? Primarily, as far as what we have in the text, we can say that the people experienced various forms of lightning, thunder, smoke, cloud, trembling, and of course Moses coming and going and telling them various things at various times, which must have been thoroughly chaotic. And although we don't have their independent testimony, the narrator tells us that they attributed all this to the presence of a deity, because, of course they did. These people were living at a time when everything was attributed to a deity. Lightning, thunder, fire, smoke, earthquakes. These would always be attributed to the work of a god or gods. So this is no surprise. We are not told that the Israelite masses heard God or saw God. The eyewitness event was simply various environmental phenomena, natural or unnatural. We have no way of knowing. But to many modern believers, especially many Jews, the theophany at Sinai is the single most important miracle attested in the Bible. But the eyewitness experience leaves almost everything to be desired.